Adam moves to a big city hoping for a fresh start, but feels uneasy in his new neighborhood. He becomes increasingly paranoid, believing that people are watching and judging him. His fear intensifies after a break-in at his apartment, where he suspects a connection with a local store clerk. As events unfold, Adam is left confused, trying to make sense of what happened. Adam Freeman had always been a man who craved the new. Growing up in the small town of Fairview, where life moved at a slow, predictable pace, he often dreamed of breaking free from the chains of familiarity. Fairview was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone's business, where neighbors waved at each other from across the street, where the biggest excitement of the year was the annual summer fair. The sameness of it all weighed on Adam. He often found himself walking the same streets he had walked his whole life, passing by houses that never changed. Even as a child, he felt a growing sense of restlessness that set him apart from the other kids. While his friends found comfort in the security of small-town life, Adam saw it as a cage. He wanted more. By the time Adam reached his late 20s, most of his friends were settled. They had steady jobs, wives, children, and homes of their own. Adam, on the other hand, had none of those things. He had bounced between jobs, never quite finding his place, and had lived in the same apartment for years. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant for something else, something bigger. So when the job offer came in, Adam saw it as his chance. It wasn't the most glamorous job, data entry at a small firm in the city, but it was a step forward. It was a way out. The city represented everything Fairview wasn't: opportunity, excitement, and the chance to reinvent himself. Without hesitation, Adam accepted the job, packed up his life, and made the move. The city was overwhelming from the moment he arrived. The sheer scale of it, the noise, the constant movement. It was exhilarating but also terrifying. Adam had never seen so many people in one place, so much activity all at once. It was a far cry from the sleepy streets of Fairview. He felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety as he navigated the crowded sidewalks, dodging commuters and tourists alike. The apartment he found was far from ideal. It was on the south side of the city, in a neighborhood that was described in the listing as up and coming, which Adam quickly realized was code for rundown and neglected. The building was old, with cracks running up the walls and graffiti covering the lower floors. The windows were drafty, the floors creaked with every step, and the radiator made a terrible clanking noise whenever it was turned on. But it was all Adam could afford on his new salary, so he convinced himself it was enough for now. When he first moved in, Adam was optimistic. He was starting fresh, in a new city, with a new job. He could handle a little discomfort. He told himself that things would get better once he settled in, once he got to know the city and found his footing. But as the days passed, that initial excitement began to fade, replaced by something else, something heavier. The neighborhood was predominantly black, and while Adam had grown up in an almost exclusively white town, it wasn't something he had ever given much thought. He considered himself open-minded, someone who didn't judge people based on the color of their skin. But from the moment he stepped foot in his new neighborhood, he felt out of place in a way that he hadn't expected. On his first day, as he walked down the street, he noticed the way people looked at him, not with open hostility, but with something more subtle. There was a wariness in their eyes, a quiet curiosity, as if they were trying to figure out what he was doing there. Adam could feel their gazes following him as he passed, lingering just a moment too long. It was uncomfortable, but he told himself it was all in his head. He was the new guy after all. It was normal for people to be curious. That first week, Adam tried to explore the neighborhood, to get a sense of the place that was now his home. He walked to the park nearby, where groups of teenagers played basketball, their laughter echoing through the streets. He noticed the way their game would slow as he approached, their eyes tracking his movements. He gave them a nod, trying to be friendly, but they didn't respond. They just watched him until he turned the corner and was out of sight. The corner store quickly became a regular stop for Adam. It was a small, dingy shop with narrow aisles crammed with snacks, drinks, and household essentials. The air inside was heavy with the smell of cleaning products and stale air. The shelves lined with items that looked like they had been there for years. The man behind the counter, Ray, was a large, imposing figure. His arms were covered in tattoos, and his face seemed to be perpetually set in a scowl. Ray barely acknowledged Adam when he walked in, his eyes flicking up from his phone for only a second before returning to the screen. Adam had tried to make small talk that first time, asked Ray how long the store had been in business, how busy the area got during the weekends, but Ray didn't seem interested. He rang up Adam's items in silence, his expression never changing, and slid the change across the counter without a word. It was the same every time Adam visited the store. Ray never spoke more than a few words, and the silence between them was thick with something Adam couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't hostility exactly, but it wasn't welcoming either. But it wasn't just Ray. There were always two men hanging around at the back of the store, leaning against the shelves, talking quietly to each other. Every time Adam walked in, they would stop talking and watch him, their eyes following him as he moved through the aisles. They never said anything to him, but their stares made his skin crawl. It was like they were waiting for something, waiting to see what he would do. Adam started to avoid the corner store whenever he could. He didn't like the way Ray looked at him, didn't like the way the two men at the back of the store made him feel. He would walk several blocks out of his way to a larger grocery store, even though it was more expensive. But even then, the feeling of being watched never left him. Work was monotonous, just as Adam had expected. The data entry job required little more than typing numbers into spreadsheets and responding to emails. The office was small and cramped, a sea of gray cubicles lit by harsh fluorescent lights. Adam's co-workers were polite but distant, their interactions confined to brief exchanges of pleasantries. He tried to make conversation during lunch breaks, but it always felt forced, as if no one was particularly interested in getting to know him. Lunchtime became a quiet affair for Adam. He would sit alone in the break room, scrolling through his phone or reading a book while the others gathered in small groups, chatting and laughing. He never felt unwelcome, but he never felt included either. It was a strange kind of isolation, one that mirrored the way he felt in his neighborhood. Adam had expected the city to be a place where he could find himself, where he could become part of something bigger than the small life he had left behind. But instead, he felt more disconnected than ever. The city was vast, teeming with life, but it seemed like none of that life had anything to do with him. He was just one face among millions, unnoticed and unimportant. The commute to and from work only added to that sense of isolation. Adam took the bus every day, sitting near the back, his headphones in, his eyes fixed on the window as the city blurred by. The bus was always crowded, filled with people coming and going, but it was the same as everywhere else. No one ever spoke to him, and he never spoke to anyone. It was easier that way. One evening, on his way home from work, Adam overheard a conversation between two men sitting a few rows ahead of him. They were talking about gentrification, about how the neighborhood was changing, about how people were moving in and driving up rent prices. "They don't care about us," one of the men said. "They come in, and the next thing you know, the rent's too high for anyone who's been here for years. They don't care about the community. They just want a cheap place to live." The other man grunted in agreement. "Yeah, they say they're making the neighborhood better, but better for who? Not for us." Adam felt a sinking feeling in his chest as he listened. He didn't need to hear the rest to know who they were talking about. People like him, outsiders, people who didn't belong. Adam had always considered himself a rational person. He didn't believe in superstition or conspiracy theories, and he wasn't prone to jumping to conclusions. But the longer he stayed in the neighborhood, the more he started to question everything around him. The feeling of being watched never went away. It followed him everywhere he went, down the street, on the bus, even in his own apartment. At first, he had convinced himself that it was just his imagination, that he was overreacting. But as the weeks passed, that explanation seemed less and less convincing. It wasn't just the way people looked at him. It was the way conversations seemed to stop when he walked by, the way people would glance at him from the corners of their eyes, as if they were trying not to be obvious about it. It was the whispers that seemed to follow him, the quiet murmurs that died down as soon as he got too close. Adam started to avoid going out unless it was absolutely necessary. He stopped walking to the park, stopped trying to engage with the people in the neighborhood. The teenagers who played basketball in the park still watched him whenever he passed, their eyes tracking his movements in a way that made his skin crawl. The older men outside the liquor store never greeted him, never acknowledged his presence, but their silence felt heavier now, more deliberate. He began to dread the bus rides to and from work. The faces of the people around him blurred together, but the feeling of being watched never left. He couldn't shake the sensation that people were talking about him, that they were waiting for him to slip up, to do something that would confirm whatever suspicions they had about him. One evening, as Adam was walking home from the bus stop, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A group of men standing near the entrance to his building, their faces obscured by the shadows cast by the streetlights. For a moment, Adam's heart raced, and he hesitated, unsure of whether to approach or turn back. But before he could make a decision, one of the men stepped forward, his face coming into view. It was one of the men from the corner store, the one who had always watched Adam in silence. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Adam could feel his pulse quickening, the weight of the man's gaze pressing down on him like a physical force. Without a word, the man turned and walked away, the rest of the group following him. Adam stood frozen in place, his mind reeling. What had just happened? Why had they been there? What did they want? The paranoia that had been simmering beneath the surface now bubbled over, consuming Adam's every thought. He became hyper-aware of every sound, every movement in the building. He started double-checking the locks on his doors and windows, making sure everything was secure before he went to bed. He even bought a small baseball bat and kept it by his bed just in case. But no matter what he did, the feeling of being watched never went away. One night, Adam woke to the sound of something scraping against the window. At first, he thought he had imagined it, but then he heard it again, a faint, insistent scraping, like something brushing against the glass. His heart pounded in his chest as he got out of bed and walked over to the window. He peered outside, but the street below was empty, the only light coming from the flickering street lamp on the corner. But when Adam looked closer, he saw it, a small crack in the glass, barely noticeable, but there all the same. His stomach dropped. Had someone been outside? Had they tried to break in? Adam stood there for a long time, staring at the crack in the window, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next morning, Adam called the building's maintenance team to come fix the window. A gruff older man arrived later that afternoon, replacing the glass without saying much. Adam tried to ask if there had been any other reports of broken windows in the building, but the man just shrugged. "Could be anything," the man said. "City's rough. Sometimes things just break." Adam nodded, but the explanation didn't make him feel any better. It happened a few nights later. It was just after midnight when Adam woke to the sound of shattering glass. His heart leaped into his throat as he sat up in bed, straining to hear over the pounding of his pulse in his ears. The apartment was dark, but he could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway. Someone was inside. Adam's mind raced with panic. He grabbed his phone, fumbling to dial 911, but his hands were shaking too badly to hit the right buttons. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were just outside his bedroom door. Then the door creaked open, and two figures stepped inside. Their faces were hidden beneath dark hoods, and the dim light from the hallway cast long shadows across the room, making them appear even more menacing. Adam's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer terror of the situation. One of the intruders held a crowbar, while the other carried a small flashlight, the beam sweeping across the floor as they moved into the room. They didn't say a word, didn't make a sound. Their movements were methodical, purposeful. It was as if they knew exactly what they were looking for. Adam's mind raced. Why were they here? Was this a random break-in, or had they come for him specifically? The paranoia that had been building inside him for weeks now surged to the surface, filling his mind with 100 terrifying possibilities. Slowly, Adam reached for the baseball bat he had stashed under his bed, his fingers trembling as they closed around the handle. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound of his pulse deafening in his ears. He knew he had to act fast, but his body refused to move, frozen in fear as the two figures continued their search. The man with the crowbar approached the dresser, his movements calm, almost leisurely. He didn't seem to be in a hurry. He didn't even seem to notice Adam sitting on the bed, watching him in horror. The second man, the one with the flashlight, began rifling through the drawers, pulling out clothes and papers, tossing them carelessly onto the floor. This isn't happening, Adam told himself. This can't be real. But it was. The cold air that seeped in through the broken window, the sound of the intruder's footsteps on the creaking floorboards, it was all too real. And as much as Adam wanted to pretend this was just a nightmare, he knew it wasn't. He was in danger, and he needed to do something before it was too late. His grip tightened on the baseball bat, and he took a deep, steadying breath. Now or never, he thought. Before he could make his move, one of the intruders stepped into the beam of the flashlight, and Adam saw it, the tattoo on the man's arm, a snake coiling up toward his shoulder. Adam's heart skipped a beat. He had seen that tattoo before. It was Ray's tattoo. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Ray had sent them. The man who had barely spoken to him, who had watched him in silence every time he entered the corner store, had been watching him all along. And now he had sent these men to ransack his apartment. But why? What had Adam done to deserve this? The man with the crowbar turned toward the bed, his eyes locking onto Adam's for the first time. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick in the air. Then, without warning, the man raised the crowbar, his grip tightening as he prepared to strike. Adam's instincts took over. He swung the baseball bat with all the strength he could muster, the sound of metal colliding with metal echoing through the room as the crowbar clanged against the floor. The man stumbled back, surprised by the sudden resistance, and Adam scrambled out of bed, his heart racing. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. He bolted for the door, his feet pounding against the floor as he raced down the hallway, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him, he could hear the intruders cursing, their footsteps quickening as they chased after him. Adam's mind was a blur. What now? What could he do? He couldn't fight them off, not both of them. His only option was to get out of the building, to find help. He darted down the stairs, nearly tripping over his own feet as he rounded the corner and burst through the front door of the apartment building. The cold night air hit him like a slap to the face, but he barely registered it. He kept running, his legs burning with the effort, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He didn't stop until he reached the end of the block, where the street lights cast a dim glow on the deserted sidewalk. For a moment, Adam stood there, his hands on his knees, his body shaking with adrenaline. He looked back at the building, half expecting the intruders to come barreling after him, but the street was empty. There was no sign of them. The police arrived within minutes of Adam's panicked call. He hadn't known what else to do but dial 911 once he had caught his breath, his hands trembling so badly he could barely hold the phone. He had given the dispatcher a hurried, disjointed explanation of the break-in, his voice shaky and breathless. Now, as the flashing red and blue lights lit up the street, Adam stood outside his apartment building, wrapped in a blanket that one of the officers had draped over his shoulders. The officer in charge, Detective Harris, was a tall, middle-aged man with graying hair and sharp, observant eyes. He listened quietly as Adam recounted what had happened, his notepad in hand, occasionally scribbling down notes as Adam spoke. "They didn't take anything," Adam said, his voice hoarse. "They just trashed the place. I don't understand why. I don't even know them." Harris nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And you're sure you didn't recognize either of them?" Adam hesitated, the image of the snake tattoo flashing in his mind. One of them had a tattoo on his arm, a snake winding up toward his shoulder. "I've seen it before. On Ray." "Ray?" Harris repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Who's Ray?" "The guy who runs the corner store," Adam explained. "He has the same tattoo. I think he sent them." For the first time, a flicker of surprise crossed Harris's face. "Ray, from the corner store? You're sure about that?" Adam nodded, though doubt crept into his mind. Could it really be Ray? He had barely interacted with the man, aside from the occasional transaction at the store. Why would Ray want to send people to break into his apartment? But the tattoo, it had to mean something. Adam was sure of it. Harris scribbled something in his notepad, then looked back up at Adam. "We'll look into it. For now, I suggest you stay somewhere else for the night. We'll have officers canvassing the area, and we'll check the security cameras to see if we can get any leads on who these guys are." Adam nodded, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He hadn't even thought about where he would sleep that night. His apartment was in ruins, and the thought of going back inside sent a shiver down his spine. "I'll stay with a friend," Adam lied, though he wasn't sure who he could call. He didn't have many friends in the city. Harris gave him a sympathetic look before motioning to one of the other officers. "We'll be in touch." The next morning, Adam woke up on a friend's couch, his body sore and his mind heavy with the events of the night before. He hadn't slept well, his dreams plagued by images of the two intruders, their faces hidden beneath those dark hoods, their movements slow and deliberate as they tore through his apartment. But one image haunted him more than any other: the snake tattoo. It didn't make sense. Why would Ray send people to break into his apartment? Adam had never done anything to provoke the man, had barely even spoken to him, and yet the tattoo was undeniable. And the more Adam thought about it, the more it began to gnaw at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he was missing, some piece of the puzzle that hadn't yet fallen into place. Later that afternoon, Harris called. "Adam," he said, his voice calm but serious, "we've been looking into your case, and there's something you need to know." Adam's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "Yeah, there was an incident at the corner store this morning," Harris continued. "Ray was found dead, shot outside the store." Adam's blood ran cold. "Dead? But how?" "We're still investigating the details," Harris explained. "But I thought you should know. It complicates things, given what you told me last night. We're going to run the prints from your apartment and check the footage from the cameras. But right now, we don't have a clear suspect." Adam sank into the couch, his mind spinning. Ray was dead? The man who had barely acknowledged his existence? Who had been nothing but a silent presence at the corner store? Gone. And now the break-in, the tattoo, the strange events of the past few weeks. All of it seemed even more confusing, more inexplicable. He thanked Harris for the call and hung up, staring blankly at the wall. The paranoia that had gripped him for so long now felt hollow, replaced by a sense of confusion and dread. If Ray was dead, then who had broken into his apartment? Who were the men with the tattoo? As the days passed, Adam couldn't shake the feeling that he had been wrong all along. The paranoia that had consumed him for weeks had clouded his judgment, making him see threats where there were none. The glances, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. It had all been in his head, a product of his own insecurities, his own fears. The neighborhood hadn't turned on him. The people around him hadn't been plotting against him. They were just living their lives, going about their days as they always had. Adam had been the outsider, the one who didn't belong. But it wasn't because of them. It was because of him. In the end, the real enemy hadn't been the people in the neighborhood, or even the men who had broken into his apartment. The real enemy had been inside him all along. Months later, Adam moved out of the city, unable to shake the lingering sense of unease that had settled over him. He returned to a quieter life, far from the noise and chaos of the city. But the memories of that time stayed with him, a constant reminder of how easily fear could twist the world around him. He no longer saw the shadows as something external, something to be feared. He understood now that the shadows had always been a reflection of his own doubts, his own insecurities. And that, perhaps, was the scariest truth of all. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. For more gripping stories that challenge perspectives and make you think, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Your support helps us keep creating meaningful content, and we appreciate every single one of you for being part of this journey. Thanks again, and see you in the next one.